The morning of October 2nd, 1997, arrived in Ashford, Illinois, like any other fall day, with gray clouds hanging low over the rooftops and a chill in the damp air that made everyone hurry along the cracked sidewalks. The scent of wet leaves clung to everything, and gutters overflowed from last night's steady rain. In the McCrae household, the air was tense even before sunrise. Carla McCrae stirred burnt coffee on the old gas stove, her hand shaking from exhaustion and worry she refused to name. She wore a fraying blue robe and shuffled across the linoleum floor as she heard her daughter's footsteps in the hallway, sneakers squeaking slightly with each step. Emily was only 11, but that morning she seemed older, somehow, shoulders hunched under the weight of a canvas backpack stuffed with books and scribbled worksheets. Carla noticed how Emily's hair was tangled at the ends and felt a twinge of guilt for snapping at her the night before over unfinished homework. Carla tried to make small talk, asking if Emily wanted toast or oatmeal, but the words fell flat in the cramped, faded kitchen, where time itself seemed stuck. Emily busied herself tying and retying her shoelaces, avoiding eye contact, refusing the food without saying a word. The silence had grown heavy between them since the argument about homework and grades, a silence Carla did not know how to break. The small radio on the counter played local news in a low drone, reporting nothing of consequence except that rain was likely to continue through the day. Carla glanced at the clock on the microwave and felt panic bloom in her chest as the time slipped away. She wanted to tell Emily to have a good day, to tell her she loved her, but the words caught in her throat. She settled instead for a tired sigh as she watched Emily rise, sling her bag over one shoulder, and walk toward the door without so much as a backward glance. Emily pulled the door open slowly, letting in a cold gust of air that rattled the loose panes of the old screen door. Carla watched from behind her coffee mug as her daughter stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under her slight weight. The drizzle had softened into a heavy mist, turning the front yard into a blur of dark green grass and mud-splashed puddles. Emily stood for a moment at the edge of the steps, head lowered, as if bracing herself for something unseen. Carla wanted to call out to tell her she was sorry, but she remained frozen in place, watching as Emily adjusted the straps of her bag and began walking down the cracked front path. Even from the window, Carla noticed that Emily was moving slowly, dragging her feet, as if she did not want to reach school at all. It was the first time in years she had left without shouting goodbye or smiling over her shoulder. The street outside was nearly empty, except for one old sedan rumbling past its windshield wipers, squeaking with each pass. Emily's sneakers squished in the wet gravel of the shoulder, and she kept her eyes locked on the ground ahead, refusing to look back at the house she had just left. She had once loved walking to school, especially in fall, when the leaves crunched underfoot and the cool air made everything feel new and alive. But lately, the walk felt heavy, like it stretched for miles, even though it was only a few blocks. Emily turned the corner onto Lincoln Avenue, passing Mrs. Reynolds' tidy yard, with its pumpkins lined up in a row, each carved face grinning despite the gloom. She forced herself to wave when Mrs. Reynolds appeared at the front door to shake out a rug, and for a brief moment her small smile looked genuine. But as soon as Mrs. Reynolds disappeared back inside, Emily let her arm fall limply to her side, the fake cheer dropping from her face like a mask. She shivered in the cold, damp air and felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She remembered her mother's face in the kitchen, drawn, and gray eyes shadowed with worry and unspoken words. She wondered if her mom was watching her now through the fogged-up kitchen window. A part of her hoped she would see and run outside to call her back, but the street remained empty, except for the dull hum of distant traffic. She adjusted her bag again and turned down a narrow side street she usually avoided, deciding on a whim to skip the shortcut she normally took through the old schoolyard. Emily kept her head down as she walked, her breath forming small clouds in the chill, the weight of her bag pulling at her thin shoulders. She knew she was running late, but did not care. Every step felt like a protest she could not voice at home. The side street was lined with neglected houses, faded paint peeling in long curls, porches sagging under the weight of old furniture and junk. She glanced once at a cracked window that reflected her pale face back at her hair, matted and eyes red from crying the night before. She pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. In the distance, the school bell rang once a muffled clang she could barely hear over the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. At home, Carla sat back down at the kitchen table, the smell of burnt coffee now nauseating. She felt the silence around her like a punishment, every tick of the clock reminding her of what she had not said. She wanted to go after Emily, to run down the street and catch her by the hand to apologize for the harsh words and the cold shoulder. But she stayed, frozen tears filling her eyes and making the room swim. She thought of the last thing she had said the night before, shouted really about being lazy and ungrateful. She told herself there would be time to fix it, that Emily would come home from school and they would talk. She would make her favorite dinner. They would watch old VHS movies on the ancient player that whined with every rewind. There would be time to make it right. Outside, the clouds thickened the mist, turning back to a thin, persistent drizzle that soaked the leaves and pooled in the broken pavement. Emily's footsteps grew fainter as she moved farther away, absorbed by the gray morning. Ashford was the kind of town where people trusted their neighbors, where kids walked to school alone without a second thought. But that morning the town felt different, like the world had shifted in a way no one could quite see yet. The air itself felt wrong, heavy with unsaid words and unfinished apologies. Later, people would ask each other if they noticed anything strange that morning and anything out of place. They would remember the clouds and the chill, the way the rain seemed colder than usual, the way the town felt like it was holding its breath. Emily did not know she was being watched, did not see the old green pickup parked half-hidden behind the vacant lot on the corner. She did not hear the soft click of a lighter as a man in the cab flicked ash onto the floorboards and leaned forward to watch her disappear around the bend. She did not know that her name would soon be on every lip in Ashford, printed in bold letters on flyers taped to telephone poles, and store windows spoken in hushed, trembling voices over kitchen tables late at night. That morning was just another day to her, a day that began with silence and ended in something far worse. She was only 11, too young to know how a single choice could echo for years, too young to realize she had already changed everything just by walking out the door. Emily's path curved away from the tidy homes and well-kept lawns of her usual route, leading instead into a quieter stretch, lined with small, sagging houses whose owners seemed to have given up on repairs. The drizzle soaked through her thin jacket, causing it to cling to her arms and weigh her down. She walked slowly, letting her shoes slap in small puddles, watching the ripples spread like tiny earthquakes. She remembered that she had left her homework half done, and thought briefly of the argument with her mother. She tried to swallow the tightness in her throat, but it remained pressing against her voice so that she felt she might cry without warning. She lifted her head just once, catching sight of the old sycamore at the corner that always felt like a marker between the safe parts of town and the places she had promised not to go. She stepped past it anyway, refusing to turn around, even though part of her wanted desperately to see if anyone was coming after her. A block away, Mrs. Reynolds was standing in her doorway holding the handle of a mop with both hands as if it were a staff. She had been watching Emily out of habit the way she watched every child in the neighborhood, convinced she had an unspoken duty to keep them safe. She called out a greeting, but her voice was swallowed by the damp air and the rattle of an old sedan shifting gears at the stop sign. Emily did not wave this time. She just kept moving, shoulders hunched against the cold steps, slow but deliberate. Mrs. Reynolds watched until the girl disappeared behind the overgrown hedge that marked the property line of the old abandoned lot. She would remember later how odd it was that Emily had seemed so determined to avoid the main street. She would tell the police this many times, her voice cracking, as she insisted that she just thought the girl wanted to be alone, that she did not know she should have run after her. Further down the street, the rain picked up again, drumming against trash can lids and bouncing in silver beads off the hoods of parked cars. Emily wiped her nose on her sleeve, shivering with each gust of wind. She felt the sudden prickling awareness of being watched, but told herself it was nothing, just the way the streetlights flickered in the gray morning or the rustle of wet leaves in the wind. She had never liked this block. Even in summer it felt dim and neglected shadows pooling under the eaves of houses whose windows were clouded with grime. She crossed the street carefully, her sneakers squeaking on the slick blacktop. For a moment she looked over her shoulder but saw nothing except the empty road and a dog watching her from behind a chain-link fence, its nose pressed against the metal as it whined softly. In the distance, a school bell rang, muffled by the weather, marking the start of homeroom. Emily felt her heart twist. She was late, but that had been her plan in some unspoken way. She wanted to be late. She wanted someone to notice. But even as she imagined the teacher marking her, absent her mother realizing she was not at school, she felt a wave of panic she could not explain. She turned left at the old fence, taking a path she had never used, where weeds crowded the cracked sidewalk, and the smell of wet soil was stronger than anywhere else in town. The air felt colder there, or perhaps it was just the fear crawling up her spine. She walked faster, clutching the straps of her backpack until her fingers ached. She heard a noise behind her, then like gravel shifting under a heavy boot, and she spun around so quickly she stumbled. But there was nothing. Only the street, slick and empty. She waited for a moment, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She closed her eyes, counting to 5 in the way her teacher had shown her when she got too angry or scared. She listened to the rain tapping on leaves, to the wind pushing water through the gutters in thick streams. When she opened her eyes again, she felt calmer, though the hair on her neck still stood up. She adjusted her backpack once more and turned back toward the school, ready to admit defeat and take the shortcut through the field. But she paused when she saw the old green pickup parked at the curb. She did not remember seeing it there before. The windows were fogged up from the inside. She squinted, trying to see if anyone was in it, but the windshield was too dirty. She felt the urge to run, but her legs would not move. Inside the house, Carla washed her coffee cup slowly, the water running too hot over her fingers, turning them red. She stared out the window, willing herself to see Emily's small figure coming back up the path. She imagined it so clearly that for a moment she almost believed it. She replayed their last conversation in her head, each word striking like a slap. She knew she should call the school, ask if Emily had arrived, but she felt ashamed, as if she were admitting she had failed in some fundamental way. So she waited, telling herself it was still early, that the school would call if something was wrong. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the old screen door and sending the dry leaves in spirals across the porch. Emily hesitated one last time before stepping closer to the pickup. She could see now that the driver's side door was cracked open a few inches. The air smelled like old cigarettes and damp fabric. She thought she heard breathing, but the wind made it impossible to tell. She took another step and dropped her backpack onto the wet pavement with a dull slap. She bent to pick it up, her fingers numb and clumsy. She did not hear the footsteps coming up behind her. By the time she straightened, it was too late. The street remained silent, except for the rustle of leaves and the tap of rain on metal. The news spread through Ashford faster than the wind-driven rain. By noon, the school secretary had called Carla to ask why Emily was absent without a note. Carla dropped the phone in the sink, water splashing across the counter, and scrambled to pick it up with shaking fingers. Her voice cracked as she lied that she would be there shortly. She did not remember driving to the school, only the sound of windshield wipers dragging across glass, and her own heart beating too loudly in her ears. The hallway smelled of floor polish and wet boots. Teachers avoided her eyes as she marched to the principal's office, where she was told Emily had never arrived at all. The words seemed to echo off the pale walls, leaving her stunned and breathless. She sat heavily in the chair by the desk, feeling the old vinyl crack beneath her weight as she tried to understand what had just happened. Outside the building, parents arrived for early pickup as the weather worsened, clutching umbrellas against the wind. Carla waited in the front office with her head in her hands, barely hearing the secretary on the phone with the police. Her vision blurred, making the room tilt at odd angles. When she blinked the tears away, she saw an officer arrive, water running from the brim of his hat. He knelt in front of her, voice low and deliberate, asking for a description for the last time she saw Emily, for anything unusual that morning. Carla shook her head, repeating over and over that she did not know that they had fought, but she never imagined Emily would run away. She clutched her coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering as though the cold had seeped into her bones and would never leave again. Word of Emily's disappearance spread from house to house with frightening speed. Neighbors left their dinners simmering on stoves to gather on porches, shouting updates through the rain. Mrs. Reynolds wiped her wet hair from her face and insisted she had seen Emily, but could not say which direction she had gone. By dusk, the local volunteer fire department had joined the search, their flashlights cutting arcs through the sodden twilight. The glow from police cruisers blinked at every intersection, blocking traffic and turning back curious drivers. Carla walked the streets with them, her shoes filling with water, refusing to stop even when the rain fell in sheets so thick she could hardly see. She called Emily's name until her voice cracked, until the sound of it seemed to mock her with every unanswered echo. At the edge of town, volunteers combed the narrow paths through old lots and wooded patches where children sometimes played after school. The wet ground made every footstep sink and squelch, soaking socks and numbing feet. Dogs barked wildly, pulling at their leashes' noses pressed to the muddy earth as their handlers urged them forward. Searchers checked every shed and garage, rapped on doors of homes that had stood empty for years. Police set up a command post in the back of a hardware store, maps spread across folding tables, radios crackling with status reports. The air smelled of wet wool and cold coffee as neighbors argued about the best places to check next. Carla refused to go home, refused to rest her eyes wild with fear as she demanded they keep looking. By midnight, the rain had stopped, but the cold deepened, turning puddles into slick sheets of black water that reflected the searchlights like shattered glass. The police chief tried to convince Carla to go home for a few hours of sleep to wait for daylight. She shoved his hand away, tears leaving cold tracks on her muddy face. She wandered toward the riverbank, convinced she might see Emily's small figure walking alone along the water's edge. Instead, she found only driftwood and litter carried by the swollen current. Behind her, the searchers called her name, gently afraid to scare her further, afraid of what they might find. She turned on them in fury, screaming that they did not understand, that they were not trying hard enough, her voice raw and broken. Throughout the night, the search continued in grim silence. Lights moved through the trees, bobbing like pale ghosts as volunteers pushed through underbrush. Some whispered prayers under their breath, afraid of what daylight would reveal. Others walked with heads bowed, too exhausted to speak. By dawn, the sky lightened to a bruised gray, the rain starting again in thin, cold threads. The searchers regrouped at the command post, comparing notes, scratching out new search grids on soggy paper. Carla stood among them, hollow-eyed, her clothes stiff with dried mud. She would not sit, would not drink the hot coffee someone pressed into her hands. She stared at the map, as if sheer will could pull her daughter home. The police brought in more resources. Canine teams from a neighboring county arrived, their handlers grim and efficient, leading the dogs along likely routes and through overgrown fields. Reporters began arriving in battered vans, their breath puffing in the cold air as they set up cameras. They asked pointed questions about the family's past, about arguments and punishments, about whether Emily had run away before. Carla turned away from them, her face pale with rage and grief. She refused to speak on camera. Neighbors crowded closer, their arms around her, some crying openly. Children clung to their parents' coats, wide-eyed, old enough to understand something terrible had happened in their safe small town. Days became weeks, and the urgency of the search faded into a heavy routine that hung over Ashford like a low cloud. Flyers curled on telephone poles, the ink running from constant rain. Police officers who had once knocked on every door now sat behind desks, tapping at keyboards and shuffling thin case files. Carla sat at her kitchen table with stacks of those flyers in front of her, pressing new tape onto their edges, even though no one wanted to hang them anymore. She studied Emily's smiling face, memorizing every line, every freckle, as if she could will her home. The coffee went cold in her cup, untouched, while the radio mumbled quietly in the background about the coming winter storm. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in the front window, and the house felt empty, too big, as though it had given up waiting for laughter to return. Todd McCrae. Emily's father spent more nights at the corner bar than he did at home. He nursed cheap whiskey until his head went heavy, slumping over the sticky counter as the bartender wiped around his arms. His eyes were bloodshot from drink and sleepless nights spent pacing their quiet living room. He avoided Carla's gaze when he did come home, shuffling past her with the distant, numb look of someone who had lost too much to hold on to hope. They fought in low, hoarse voices late at night, the words raw and jagged, accusing and defending in turns until they fell silent out of sheer exhaustion. One night, Todd grabbed a bundle of Emily's drawings and hurled them into the fireplace, the paper curling in bright flames, while Carla screamed at him to stop. He fell to his knees, sobbing, as the house filled with the acrid stench of burning paper. The police chief called the McCraes into the station after a month had passed. Carla sat in a hard-backed chair under the flickering fluorescent light, her hands gripping her knees to keep them from trembling. She watched as the detective slid a thin folder across the table, the man's expression grave but resigned. He explained that the active search was ending, that they could not justify the overtime, that there were no new leads. Carla felt her vision swim and had to blink hard to see him clearly. She shook her head again and again, refusing to touch the folder. Her voice cracked as she asked what she was supposed to do now. The detective looked at his hands before mumbling that she could keep talking to people, keep her eyes open, but that officially the case would go cold. He pushed the folder back toward himself and closed it with a quiet finality that seemed to echo off the walls. Winter arrived harsh and early that year. Snow drifted against doorways, muffling the sound of passing cars and making the whole town seem slower, quieter. Carla stood on street corners in a heavy coat, her breath steaming in the frigid air, taping new flyers to the same telephone poles, even when she had to peel off the wet remains of the old ones first. She asked strangers in the grocery store if they had seen her daughter, showing them a photo that was becoming tattered at the edges. Some nodded politely, some avoided her eyes, and others just shook their heads sadly. She called the police station every few days, asking if they had anything new, any tips at all. The dispatcher's voice grew soft and apologetic, repeating that there was nothing to report. Carla would hang up and lean against the wall, pressing the phone to her forehead until her legs gave out. Todd stopped coming home entirely after Christmas. Carla heard he had moved into a rented room over the bar, paying with cash he borrowed from old friends who pitied him. She called once, her voice shaking with anger and grief, but he hung up without saying a word. She screamed at the dial tone until her throat went raw, then collapsed on the floor of their bedroom, clutching Emily's stuffed rabbit to her chest. That night she finally packed his things into trash bags and left them by the door, but no one ever came to get them. They sat there for weeks, a silent accusation she stepped over every day. The house fell into disrepair dishes stacked in the sink, curtains hanging askew, as though it had given up pretending to be a home at all. By spring, people in town talked less about Emily and more about taxes, road repairs, and local gossip. Mrs. Reynolds still watched the street, her eyes tired, but she no longer called out when children passed by. Parents held their kids' hands a little tighter, at least for a while, but even that faded with time. Carla sat alone in her living room TV, glowing soundlessly piles of flyers untouched on the coffee table. Sometimes she woke up thinking she had heard Emily's voice calling from the hall. She would sit up in bed, listening intently, heart pounding until the silence pressed in again. She spoke to fewer people. As the months passed, the conversations awkward, full of sympathy that felt cold and heavy in her hands. A year after Emily's disappearance, the town of Ashford had settled into an uneasy quiet, where people nodded solemnly at Carla in the grocery store, but rarely spoke her name. Carla still woke before dawn most days, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold before she drank it. She thumbed through the worn stack of flyers, smoothing the creases with care. One morning she received a call that made her heart leap so violently she nearly dropped the phone. A deputy from Kentucky said someone at a truck stop diner had seen a girl matching Emily's description. The woman had insisted the girl was older, but had the same eyes, and a scar on her chin, the same one Emily got falling from her bike. Carla pressed the phone so hard to her ear it hurt her voice hoarse, as she demanded every detail, every scrap of information they could give her. Within days, Carla packed what little she needed and drove south through 2 states. The roads blurred under heavy gray skies and intermittent rain that smeared the windshield until she could barely see. She stopped only for gas and weak coffee that scalded her tongue. When she reached the town, the landscape looked unfamiliar and hostile, all low buildings and neon signs flickering in the wet dusk. She sat in the diner's corner booth with a police officer who tried to manage her expectations gently. Carla ignored him, her eyes darting to every girl who walked through the door, searching desperately for a familiar posture, a familiar tilt of the head. The waitress finally arrived with her hands stuffed in her apron pockets, eyes darting to the cop before she sat. She described the girl in halting phrases, saying she had been quiet eyes, wide hair tucked behind her ears in the same way Emily always did. Carla pressed her fingers hard against her temples to keep herself from breaking down at the table. She asked about the scar on the chin, needing to hear it again. The waitress nodded, slowly said it was there, but faded that she remembered it because she thought it was strange to see on such a young face. The cop wrote everything down, underlining details in his notepad, while Carla dug her nails into the plastic seat cushion. But when they asked for the security footage, the manager shook his head, explaining the cameras had failed that night. They had nothing to show her. Carla's voice rose as she demanded they check again, her words tripping over each other in a ragged, desperate mess. The manager only looked away, mumbling apologies that felt like cold slaps in the face. That night, Carla sat in her cheap motel room with the thin walls and the smell of stale smoke, the television buzzing quietly without sound. She stared at her own face in the dark screen, gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hair pulled back in a hasty knot. She replayed the waitress's words over and over, each phrase like a fragile promise she dared not trust. She wondered if Emily had sat at that very booth if she had been hungry or scared, if she had looked around for help but seen no one willing to offer it. Carla covered her face with her hands and wept until the sobs turned to dry, aching gasps. The sound of traffic outside never stopped, a reminder she was far from home, from everything familiar and safe, though nothing had felt safe since Emily vanished. The next day, the local sheriff's deputy called it in officially as a possible sighting and filed a report that would be forwarded to Illinois. He shook Carla's hand awkwardly outside the diner, telling her not to lose hope that these tips sometimes led somewhere. She nodded, though the movement felt stiff and false, her head pounding with exhaustion and rage. She got into her car and sat with her forehead pressed to the steering wheel, willing herself to keep breathing. She wanted to pound the horn, to scream, until her throat bled, to demand why nothing could be simple or easy, why every answer had to be just out of reach. When she finally drove away, she did not look back, the rain hitting the windshield in fat, cold drops that blurred the neon and headlights into unsteady smears. Back in Ashford, neighbors whispered about the trip in hushed voices over fences and coffee cups. Mrs. Reynolds told people she prayed Carla would come home with Emily, but confessed she did not believe it anymore. The flyers grew more tattered, some falling off the poles, entirely leaving ghostly rectangles of faded glue. Carla returned days later, pulling into the driveway she barely recognized as her own. She left her suitcase in the car, shuffling into the darkened house that smelled of damp and mildew. She collapsed onto the couch without removing her coat, staring at the blank television screen, the silence so complete it roared in her ears. She replayed every word from Kentucky, the waitress's hesitant confirmation of the scar, the cameras that had failed, the empty, useless promise of official reports filed away to gather dust. After the failed lead in Kentucky, Carla withdrew even further from the world, her daily movements reduced to mechanical tasks that gave her no comfort. She slept on the living room couch most nights, unwilling to pass Emily's empty bedroom door. The house had taken on a lifeless quality, dust settling on picture frames, dishes stacked in the sink with dried soap scum crusting their rims. Carla sometimes sat in the dark, with only the dull orange glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, fingers tapping nervously on her knees. She heard every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, imagining the sound of Emily's voice calling to her from somewhere just beyond reach. The old stuffed rabbit she had refused to throw out lay beside her fur, matted and gray from years of clutching it too tightly. Todd's absence had solidified into something permanent. He stopped answering her calls, and the number she once dialed reflexively no longer worked. Rumor around Ashford was that he had drifted south, taking odd jobs at construction sites and living out of motels. Carla found herself hating him for abandoning Emily a second time, even as she understood the unbearable weight that had driven him away. She came across old photos once while rummaging for bills in a kitchen drawer, pictures of them at a county fair with Emily perched on Todd's shoulders, her face lit up with the kind of joy that now seemed impossible to recover. Carla sat on the cold linoleum floor for nearly an hour, tears running down her face, unchecked her breath, hitching in quiet, miserable sobs. The holidays were especially brutal, marked not by celebration, but by silence that settled heavy over everything. Carla kept the lights off through most of December, refusing to decorate, ignoring the Christmas cards that arrived with cheerful glitter and embossed snowmen. She did not go to the candlelight service at church, the one Emily had loved for the music and the cookies afterward. Neighbors dropped by, less and less, often their offers of help tapering off into strained smiles and tight nods when they passed her in the grocery store. She heard them whisper when they thought she was not listening, their words floating on the winter air like cold poison. People asked each other if she was doing all right, but no one really wanted to hear the answer. When the new year came, it brought no sense of renewal. Instead, Carla found the quiet suffocating. She took to walking the streets late at night, sometimes wandering as far as the edge of town before realizing she had no idea how long she had been gone. She would stand at the darkened windows of shuttered businesses watching her own reflection, stare back with hollow eyes, hair tangled from the wind. The police had long stopped checking in regularly, but once or twice a new officer would see her and offer to drive her home, their eyes kind but pitying in a way that made her feel exposed. She always refused, muttering that she needed the air, that she was fine. She was never fine. By spring, Carla began skipping shifts at the grocery store where she worked part-time, the manager's polite but worried calls going unanswered. She could not stand the fluorescent lights, the small talk about coupons, and weather the curious glances at her name tag that made people remember who she was. Eventually, she stopped going, entirely spending her days at home listening to the ancient answering machine beep emptily. Bills piled on the coffee table next to the flyers she no longer had the energy to hang. Her car sat unused in the driveway, its tires slowly losing air. The town carried on without her, the rhythm of daily life swallowing her absence in the way small towns often do. Carla knew she should try to find Todd, if only to confront him, to demand why he had given up so completely. But the thought of seeing his face, of knowing he would not have answers either, was too much. Sometimes she imagined tracking him down just to scream at him, to tell him how cowardly he was for leaving her to bear the weight of memory alone. Other times, she fantasized about them finding comfort in shared pain, but she could not fool herself for long. Their last conversation had ended with slammed doors and ugly words that neither could take back. Now there was only emptiness between them, as wide and cold as the dark fields on the edge of town. Years crawled by with cruel steadiness, leaving Carla older and thinner, her hair streaked with gray that she no longer bothered to dye. Ashford itself seemed to age in sympathy, its main street lined with empty storefronts, the paint flaking from porches' weeds pushing through the sidewalks. Carla moved like a ghost through the town, nodding at neighbors without ever stopping to chat. Her house felt brittle and silent, its rooms untouched, except for the living room where she slept on the couch under a thin blanket. Every so often she would wake from uneasy dreams, convinced she had heard Emily laugh from down the hall, but when she sat up, the house only offered back its cold hush. She told herself it was better to expect nothing, that hope had become too expensive to keep. Then, one morning in late October, the phone rang while she sat staring at her mug of black coffee. She blinked at it for a moment, before picking up, pressing it to her ear with cautious dread. On the other end was a detective from Indiana, his voice careful and deliberate as he asked if she was the mother of Emily McCrae. Carla felt the words like a slap. She swallowed hard, nodding before realizing he could not see her. Her voice cracked when she said yes. The detective explained that her daughter's name had appeared in a police log just days before. He read the words from the report in a dry, practiced tone, while Carla pressed her free hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing. According to the log, there had been a domestic dispute at a rural address outside of Indianapolis. Deputies had responded to the scene and spoken with a woman who insisted her name was Anna, but when asked for identification, she refused and fled on foot into nearby woods. A neighbor had reported that she arrived about a year earlier with an older man who called her M. Carla gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her fingers ached. She asked the detective to read it all again, every word needing to be sure she had not imagined it. The sound of Emily's old nickname twisted in her chest like a blade. The detective paused before saying there was no confirmation it was her daughter, but they thought she deserved to know. The next few days blurred with frantic phone calls and frantic scribbling on scraps of paper as Carla tried to piece together what little she knew. She called the Indiana department, repeatedly demanding updates. Each time she hung up, feeling both closer to and further from the truth. She heard herself pleading with strangers over the line, promising anything, if they would just keep looking, if they would not let her slip through their fingers again. She dug out the old missing persons flyers from the hall closet, smoothing their creased edges, rereading the description of the scar on Emily's chin, as if it were a prayer. The photo seemed like a cruel joke, now her daughter frozen at 11 years old, while time had stolen everything else. Carla packed a small bag with shaking hands, zipping it with a finality that made her pause. She locked the door behind her without looking back, the house groaning in the cold wind. The drive to Indiana felt endless, the roads unspooling in gray lines over endless flat fields. She stopped only for gas and bad coffee, her mind racing with possibilities both hopeful and devastating. She thought of Emily, out there somewhere, older now, her hair longer. Her voice changed. She tried to imagine what she would say if she found her, but the words crumbled before she could finish them. At night, she parked in rest stops with the seat tilted back, staring at the ceiling of her old car, until exhaustion pulled her into restless sleep. When she finally reached the small town outside Indianapolis, it was already deep into fall. The trees along the roadside bare and skeletal. She drove past fields gone to mud and narrow roads lined with sagging houses. She parked near the address from the police report, her heart thudding so loudly she felt lightheaded. She knocked on doors showing the faded photo to anyone who would answer. Some people shook their heads quickly, stepping back into warm homes, wary of the desperate woman on their porch. Others offered vague sympathy, but no help. One older woman squinted at the picture before telling Carla in a whisper that she had seen the girl who called herself Anna crying behind the local grocery store. She had offered her a ride home, but the man she was with had pulled her away, face tight with anger. Carla spent her first night in the Indiana town inside a rundown motel that smelled of mildew and cheap cleaning spray. She lay fully dressed on the thin mattress, staring at the stained ceiling, while traffic hummed along the distant highway. Her mind refused to quiet, running through every conversation she had with Emily as a child, trying to imagine how her daughter would look now, trying to picture the fear in her eyes when she ran from the police. Morning arrived in pale, cold light, seeping through yellowed curtains, and Carla forced herself up with stiff movements. She washed her face with shaking hands, and drank burnt coffee from the lobby machine before driving back toward the neighborhood in question, determined to find someone willing to talk. She stopped at a small grocery store with faded signs and a squeaky door that announced her arrival with a metallic screech. Inside, it smelled of stale bread and cheap cleaning supplies. Carla clutched the photo of Emily so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She waited at the counter until the owner finally noticed her, a man with thinning hair and eyes that looked wary, before softening with reluctant pity. Carla asked him if he had seen a woman calling herself Anna. The man hesitated, glanced at the back room as if to make sure no one was listening, then nodded slowly. He said the woman came in often for basics, always paying in cash, always nervous. He remembered she once bought children's shoes in a size that seemed too small for her age, which struck him as odd, but not his business to question. Carla felt her chest tighten painfully at this, imagining Emily trying on tiny sneakers in the harsh fluorescent light of this cramped store. She forced herself to keep her voice steady as she asked more questions. The owner lowered his voice and admitted that once he had seen the man with her grab her arm hard enough to make her flinch. She had turned away quickly, eyes down, paying for their items without another word. Carla pressed the photo closer, her voice shaking as she described Emily's scar, her old hair color the way she used to tuck it behind her ear. The owner listened without interrupting before giving a reluctant nod, saying he thought it could have been her, but that people changed. Carla wiped at her face with the back of her hand, thanking him in a voice thick with grief and relief in equal measure. She left the store and sat in her car engine off the cold seeping through her coat. She stared at her hands in her lap, fingers curled tight like claws. She forced them open slowly, pressing her palms flat against her thighs as she took deep breaths. She remembered Emily as a little girl, so full of energy that she would bounce on her toes while talking hair flying in all directions. The thought of her now quiet and skittish paying for groceries with trembling fingers made Carla feel like she was being crushed from the inside out. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, muffled by the cracked leather. When she could breathe again, she drove slowly through the neighborhood, looking at each house, each porch cluttered with old furniture and wind-blown leaves. She watched for any movement behind curtains, any figure in a window that might be watching her back. At one house, a woman smoking on the steps met her gaze and nodded slowly, as if she understood without being told. Carla parked and got out, approaching carefully with the photo in her shaking hands. The woman squinted at it, took a drag from her cigarette, and exhaled slowly before saying she had seen the girl the police were after. She described her as skinny, quiet, with hair that fell over her face. Once she had seen her crying behind the store, wiping her eyes quickly when anyone noticed. She added that the man with her never let her out of sight for long. Carla sat in her car for hours after speaking to the woman on the steps, the engine off, as the cold seemed to fill every inch of the space. She thought of Emily crying behind that grocery store, wiping her eyes quickly, afraid to be seen weak. The knowledge that her daughter had been so close and yet so unreachable twisted inside her like something sharp. Carla ran her fingers through her graying hair, pulling hard enough to sting, trying to stay focused. She could not afford to fall apart now. She pulled out her old notebook and scribbled every detail she had gathered in cramped handwriting, the pages crumpled and damp from her sweat. When the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, she started the car with a shudder and drove to the small local police station, her fingers drumming the steering wheel the whole way. Inside the station, the air smelled of burnt coffee and floor cleaner. Carla stood at the counter, her shoulders tight with determination, and asked to speak with someone about the domestic call that mentioned Anna. The officer behind the desk looked at her with weary politeness, asking for her name and reason for being there. Carla's voice trembled as she gave it, explaining she was Emily McCrae's mother and that she had driven all the way from Illinois because she believed Anna was her daughter. The words spilled out fast and frantic, filling the quiet lobby, until the officer held up his hands gently, asking her to slow down. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak evenly, describing every lead, every sighting, every scrap of information she had collected over the past 2 days. A detective finally emerged from the back, his expression neutral, but not unkind. He guided Carla into a small interview room with buzzing fluorescent lights and walls painted a dull beige that seemed to absorb all warmth. She sat on the metal chair, hands folded tight in her lap, listening as he explained they had been trying to locate Anna since she ran into the woods during the argument with the man. Carla asked about the man in a voice that cracked, despite her effort to control it. The detective described him as middle-aged, unshaven, known to local police for minor offenses, nothing violent until now. Carla leaned forward, her voice hoarse, as she asked if he had admitted anything about taking Emily. The detective paused, eyes narrowing slightly, and said they had picked him up 2 days earlier on an unrelated assault charge and had finally convinced him to talk. Carla felt the room tilt slightly as she listened. The detective described the man's confession, how he had seen Emily walking alone that day in Illinois, small, and scared her backpack slipping off one shoulder. He told police he had stopped and told her mother was in the hospital and she needed to come with him. Carla pressed her hand to her mouth, a muffled sob escaping before she could stop it. The detective continued, voice steady but softer, now explaining that the man had kept Emily on the move for years, changing names, towns, and stories. So often she no longer knew which version was real. He claimed he was protecting her from a world that would not want her convincing her mother was dead or had given up looking. Carla felt like she could not breathe the air, too heavy and stale. She asked if Emily had been hurt, and the detective looked away before admitting quietly that the man had controlled her. Isolated her, told her lies to keep her dependent. Carla closed her eyes tightly, tears slipping down her lined cheeks unchecked. She tried to imagine her little girl listening to those lies, believing them. Because she had no choice, because she was so small and scared and alone. The detective cleared his throat, saying they were still searching the wooded areas nearby, and asking if Carla wanted to see the map they were using. She nodded numbly, following him into a back room where an old map was spread over a table covered in colored pins and scribbled notes. She hovered over it, fingers tracing the lines of roads she did not know, trying to find any hint of where Emily might be. The detective placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her they would not stop until they found her. Carla nodded mutely, eyes fixed on the map, refusing to look away, even as the tears blurred her vision. She stayed there for hours, asking questions, demanding they check every lead twice, refusing to rest or eat. She watched the officers coordinate search teams, listened to the radio chatter crackle with updates, and prayed in a voice so quiet only she could hear it. When finally she left the station that night, the wind biting at her face, she climbed into her car and sat in silence for a long time before starting the engine. Her fingers trembled on the wheel, but her jaw was set tight. She would not leave until Emily was found. Carla woke before dawn in the faded motel room, the sheets tangled around her legs and the thin blanket pushed to the floor. She sat up slowly, her body aching from sleep that had never really been restful. Outside the window, the world was still dark. The parking lot illuminated only by one buzzing yellow bulb that cast long shadows across cracked asphalt. She rubbed her eyes and ran her hands through her hair, trying to tame the knots that had formed over days of worry and neglect. She stood carefully, her knees creaking, and walked to the small bathroom where she splashed cold water on her face until her skin burned, and the tears that had gathered there were washed away. She stared at herself in the mirror, taking in the lines around her eyes and mouth, the gray that threaded through her hair, the weariness that seemed to have settled in her bones for good. She took a deep breath and turned away, drying her face on a threadbare towel and straightening her shoulders as best she could. She drove to the police station before sunrise. The roads empty except for a few trucks that rolled past slowly, their headlights glaring through the early fog. When she walked in, the desk sergeant looked up in surprise at the sight of her so early, but did not say anything about it. She nodded at him and sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, folding her hands in her lap, determined to wait as long as it took. The hours stretched endlessly as officers came and went, their radios crackling with static and half-heard voices, the coffee pot gurgling on the counter in the corner. Carla watched it all with blank eyes, listening carefully whenever someone walked past her, straining to catch any scrap of news about the search. When the detective finally appeared, he approached her slowly, his eyes tired but alert. He sat beside her, explaining quietly that one of the search teams had found tracks in the mud, small, bare footprints leading away from a makeshift camp hidden in the woods. They believed they belonged to Anna. Carla pressed her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She nodded once, not trusting her voice to work. The detective placed a gentle hand on her arm, telling her they had dogs on the trail now that they would not give up. She sat back slowly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps that she tried to calm. She closed her eyes and pictured Emily as a little girl chasing fireflies in the yard, while she watched from the porch, her laughter floating on the warm night air. She held on to that memory as if it were a lifeline, refusing to let it slip away. When the detective stood, she watched him go, then closed her eyes again, praying with all the quiet desperation she could muster. She did not know who she was praying to anymore, but it felt better than sitting in silence, letting the fear crush her. Late that afternoon, the detective returned with an urgency in his step that made Carla sit up straight immediately. He knelt beside her chair, his voice low and cautious but carrying a note of hope that made her heart pound. They had found her, he said. They had found Anna. She was alive but scared, dehydrated, and refusing to speak much. Carla felt the air leave her lungs in one great, shuddering exhale as tears spilled down her face without permission. She covered her mouth with both hands, rocking slightly in her chair as the weight of the words sank in. Alive. The word sounded like salvation and punishment all at once. She listened as the detective explained that she was being taken to the hospital for evaluation, that Carla could see her soon, but should prepare herself. He warned her that it would not be like the movies, that there would be no perfect reunion. Carla nodded, wiping her face with shaking fingers, forcing herself to stand and follow him toward the door. The drive to the hospital was silent, except for the muted hum of the police radio and the steady rhythm of her heart beating too loudly in her ears. Carla watched the scenery blur past the fields and small houses, all blending into a smear of green and gray. When they pulled up to the hospital entrance, she felt her knees weaken and had to grip the door handle tightly before she could step out. She walked slowly through the automatic doors that sighed open to let her pass, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose, sharp and clean, but somehow suffocating. A nurse led her down a long hallway, her words soft and professional, explaining what they knew so far about Anna's condition. Carla barely heard any of it, her focus locked on the door at the end of the hall where her daughter waited. Inside the small room, the blinds were drawn. Half closed, the light, dim and shadowy. Emily sat on the narrow bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, hospital bracelet glinting on one thin wrist. Her hair was longer tangled and fell over her face as she refused to look up. Carla stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, her breath catching painfully in her chest. She forced her feet to move, stepping carefully closer until she was at the edge of the bed. She reached out a trembling hand, but let it fall back to her side when Emily flinched slightly. Carla swallowed hard, blinking back the fresh tears that burned her eyes. She spoke in a voice that cracked with emotion, telling Emily who she was, telling her she was sorry for everything, telling her she had never stopped looking. Emily did not respond at first, her fingers digging into the thin hospital blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. The silence between them felt vast and cold, stretching on forever. Then Emily finally lifted her head slightly, her eyes hollow and rimmed with red. She studied Carla's face for a long moment, as if searching for something she barely remembered. Carla held perfectly still, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to break whatever fragile connection had finally formed. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then she whispered one word, barely audible, a question more than anything. Mom. Carla's sob broke free as she fell to her knees beside the bed, clutching Emily's thin hand in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek as tears soaked the blanket. Emily did not pull away this time, but let her hand rest there, limp and uncertain, her eyes wet and blinking rapidly. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I would love to hear what you think about the plot, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you are watching from and what kind of stories you want to see next. Your feedback helps keep these stories coming.